Excellent. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us and for your persistence and patience as we get off to a less than ideal start. But now we're here. So my name is Lauren Rickards. I'm a professor at RMIT, where I'm director of the Urban Futures Enabling Impact platform. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to this, which is our first big public event in the Urban Futures platform, and it's a collaboration with the College of Design and Social Context at RMIT for what we're calling the Urban Futures Symposium, which is really a celebration of student work, but we also complement that with insightful intellectual conversations about big topics, and this year's one is around atmospheric futures. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming from the lands of the Boiwurrung and Woonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. And this topic of futures fits with this topic of atmospheres in a number of different ways. I was just reflecting that yesterday we actually held an event between a conversation between various RMIT academics working on atmospheres, and it became very clear that atmospheres means many different things across different disciplinary areas, which the kind of whole idea of academic tribes and territories and cultures kind of infers. And so we obviously have the kind of idea of atmospheres as air, and that we had a Earth scientists talking about the Earth's atmosphere, which I'll touch on a little bit in a minute, but we also had those working on atmospheres as a kind of vibe, a kind of mood. And when you think about pairing atmospheres with futures, you get that, you know, very much that futures is certainly a bit of a vibe at the moment. There's definitely a mood to focus on futures. And we'll hear from a dear colleague and a great scholar, Simon Marvin, about some of the great work he's been doing on that. But before we do, I'd like to first of all introduce Professor Ralph Horn, who's our Associate Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research and Innovation in the College of Design and Social Context, to offer a few words of welcome as well. Over to you, Ralph.
Thanks, Lauren. And again, I'd like to welcome everybody and also pay my respects to First Nations peoples. I'm also coming from Melbourne in the same way as Lauren, and I'd like to acknowledge them on unceded lands. I just wanted to make a couple of remarks. I'm not going to talk about what Simon's going to talk about. I think you've seen the intro, and Lauren's going to say more in a moment, but really just want to say two things. First, I would like to acknowledge Lauren Rickards' contribution to RMIT and to Urban Futures over the last few years. Lauren's about to leave us to go to La Trobe University on to setting up a new research entity there. And of course, we'll continue to work closely together. But it's been fantastic to have your contribution here, Lauren. And I just want to acknowledge that in this kind of public forum. So thank you.
Very much, Ralph.
In terms of Simon, you know, again, we go back a long way, Simon, and some over 15 years, I think it is. And really, all I would say off the top of my head, hopefully not embarrassing you, is I think Simon's probably known to all, certainly known to all urbanists, and I'm imagining there may be a mixed audience here tonight, but you'll all know Simon's work, and of course the breakthrough work that he co-authored on splintering urbanism, you know, really made a fundamental contribution to our understanding of contemporary kind of neoliberal processes in the urban context. And since then, I think Simon's continued not only to be an acute observer and re-theorizing the socio-material processes in the urban, but also, and you know, I know this through our work, Simon, your real interest in thinking about how change might happen, as well as observing processes of change. And I think that's really a remarkable and important part of your work. And then particularly how urban actors and processes kind of push boundaries and continue to reorder and push. And of course, that work on you know, verticalities and on and on this talk, I suspect, on atmospheres is exactly in that genre. So thank you. I think we're very honoured at RMIT to have Simon coming all the way from the Lake District, at least virtually, to share his thoughts. And I'm going to pass back to you, Lauren.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ralph. Yeah, and I'm sure Simon will tell you a little bit about exactly where he's coming from in a moment, but it is a nice contrast with some of the modern themes that we're talking about here. So let me share my screen here. So yeah, so here we are in this Atmospheric Futures Symposium and looking at this topic of cultivating future urban atmospheres. So just to position it, and I couldn't help myself, so if you just indulge me to just kind of explain just a little bit about why I chose this topic of atmospheric futures is it's partly because atmospheres is, of course, a key intermediary, a mediating factor, if you like, between a topic I spend a lot of time thinking about, which is the relationship between humans and climate. But it's also in and of itself a very important object and actor as well. And so if you think about it, we've got a sort of 2x3 kind of set of relationships here, which really help us to understand sort of the significance of atmospheres, if you like. So if I just run through very quickly some of the different sorts of relationships we're talking about. So perhaps, the most obvious one is, of course, that the humans having some kind of influence on the atmosphere. So, whether that's at the scale of neighbourhoods, cities, regions, as the horrific recent environmental tragedy that's still unfolding in Ohio demonstrates with the release of vinyl chloride turning into hydrogen chloride in the atmosphere there, causing huge amounts of damage. And then at a more global scale, of course, we can't not talk about greenhouse gases and, of course, in particular, carbon dioxide. And so I looked up today's level. So today we're at 417.64 parts per million, which I don't need to emphasise is, of course, a historical record. Also methane, that's at 1895 parts per million, or that was in 2021, which is the highest in 800,000 years. So that's the first side of the equation, if you like. The next is to then think about, well, okay, so, this is the kind of big climate change awakening. What we do to the atmosphere actually has effects on the Earth system, and particularly on that emergent system we know as climate. And when we think about that, there's a whole range of different aspects of that. And, the most obvious is that captured in the term global warming, and we're talking about an atmosphere that's turned out to be far more sensitive to additional greenhouse gases, including novel greenhouse gases, than was first thought. And so what we're looking at now, we've already had global surface temperature rise of about 1.09 degrees. And we're really looking at an increasing rate of increase as well. At the finer scale, what that looks like, the actual atmosphere has direct effects on the climate. So whether that's in the form of humidity that we're experiencing directly right now in Melbourne, that New South Wales has had a lot of lately with all of the very moist temperatures there that I think Simon's experiencing in the form of mist in the Lake District, we have many, many aspects of this relationship of atmosphere affecting climate. If we then turn and think about the climate affecting humans, this is, of course, a massive area. It's actually my key area, the one I'm going to be focusing most on when I moved to La Trobe, look at this climate impacts, climate adaptation question, and just to sort of focus in on one particular aspect, which is the food system. How does it have effects? It's obviously direct and indirect, so it's the actual effects on the plants and their yields, the productivity of those agricultural systems. But it's all the other sorts of things that are also affected by climate in that food system as well, including things like pathogens in our food, the fact that we rely increasingly in a hotter climate on refrigeration, which means that we're more reliant on blackouts. Okay, so that's going in one direction, but of course we need to reverse. So if we then now turn around, if you can picture yourselves turning around, we're now going to walk backwards through this. So humans directly affect the climate, not just via the atmosphere. And any architects, designers, planners in the room would be very, very aware of this. We have quite strong climatic effects through things as simple as shade and through all sorts of ways in which we interact with radiation, that other aspect that has such a strong influence on the climate. There's nothing to do with gases, nothing to do with chemistry, everything to do with physics. Then if we think about the effect of the climate, it's having a lot of feedbacks directly on the atmosphere. So when I talk about, carbon dioxide, parts per million, et cetera, all these things tend to be focused on what we experience as the atmosphere, which is the 80% of the atmosphere known as the troposphere, which reaches up on average 13 kilometres into the sky, into the atmosphere. But what we're actually finding is that climate change is affecting it. It's lifting the troposphere. It's increased about 400 metres in height since the 80s. But then the section above, the stratosphere, is actually shrinking. It's becoming thinner. It's becoming far less of a barrier to all sorts of meteorites and other things, which just kind of adds in an extraterrestrial aspect to climate change impacts. And then last but not least, the atmosphere, of course, has direct effects on humans. We know that because we rely on it with every breath we take. And we're increasingly aware, of course, that it contains things like viruses. This is the COVID era, after all, as well as a whole range of other things that we don't want to breathe in. That, of course, is not the only effect. It's all the indirect effects as well, including those via the effects on plants, via the effects on pollinators and other animals. And so what we have then is, a really, really complex system. And so when we think about how a human, different groups of humans, different actors, different interests interacting in this complex sort of trifecta of relationships, you start to see some pretty interesting patterns emerging, pretty interesting logics, pretty interesting ambitions. And that is what we're going to hear from Simon. So as Ralph said, Simon is an extremely well-known international scholar. He's based at the Urban Institute in the University of Sheffield. He's also a part-time professor at the University of Sydney in the architecture design school there, and also has connections with many other institutions, including being past chair at Durham. So with that, and I encourage you to look him up because he's got an incredible number of books, I will stop sharing and hand over to Simon, and we're going to really test the bounds of the internet here and beam you in from Beatrix Potter's cottage in the Lakes District. So over to you, Simon.
Thank you very much, Lauren, and to Ralph as well for the very, very nice introductions. Very kind of you. As you've just said, and a helpful introduction, Lauren, which I'll cross-reference to in my talk. I'm in Yew Tree Farm in the Lake District, which is a cottage Beatrix Potter left to the National Trust. So slightly unusual location. I'm aware it's your evening, so thank you very much for the audience for joining us. So I just want to, as Lauren said, I work at Sheffield and Sydney. Part of the reason I work at Sydney is I was really interested in trying to understand the Australian context in relation to atmospheres and weather change. And I'm going to briefly talk about a set of work undertaken with colleagues at Sheffield and John Rutherford, who's in LATS in CNRS in Paris. So what I want to do, next slide, please, Nick. What I want to do is talk about the atmosphere using weather as a way of thinking about how changes in the atmosphere relate to the way in which urban authorities, municipalities, private sector respond to a changing climate. And in urban studies, the weather is curiously sort of seen as naturalized and background. It's sort of, now there's a lot of work on urban climate. There's less work than you'd expect on urban weather. Next slide, please. Yet, actually, this is a slide from 2021 in the North America, where there was a heat dome got blocked over the continental North America, which produced intense heat with serious threat to human health and to crops and to animals and wildlife as well. A sort of mega atmospheric event of quite phenomenal proportions, yet also producing some quite interesting urban responses. Next slide, please. In the way that those extreme temperatures from the heat dome, an atmospheric structure of almost planetary in terms of its sort of scale, driving people to adopt novel cooling techniques. And here I think you can see the way in which large-scale atmospheric events and the microclimate of the city starts to become interrelated. Next slide. And this is happening for I think there's three things we need to understand about what's happening. Why is the urban atmosphere becoming problematized, and why is it stimulating a bricolage of highly diverse responses to the way in which it might be possible to modulate the effects of atmospheric change? And partly, as Lauren has just said, it's this notion that we're entering a new climate regime. So urban life, urban technologies and materials and buildings have all been designed around a particular climatic regime, which is changing significantly. And so that's driving consequences, social, technological, material consequences. Next slide, please. These changes are actually fundamental to how we start to understand the notion of a concept that the anthropologist Tim Ingold uses, the concept of the weather world. And Tim Ingold talks quite nicely about the way that we tend to be very focused as researchers on the sort of physical materiality of the sort of terrestrial domain, and perhaps haven't thought carefully enough about our interrelationship with the weather. In a word, they have shut out the weather. Yet even residents of hypermodern cities have to contend with the weather. And I think this notion of the weather world is quite a useful concept for thinking of how we engage with the atmosphere. Next slide, please. And Australian academics have been quite important, I think, in thinking through the concept of the weather world, not purely and solely as a sort of material condition. They also talk about this notion of more than meteorological weathering, which is Namanis and Hamilton developed this concept, which I think is really helpful for making us think about the interrelationship between changing conditions, changing atmospheric conditions, rainfall, drought, heat, thaw, and storm, as never separable from the total climate of social and political existence. So changing weather is actually socially, economically important, partly because of the different ways in which people are positioned to respond, but is also strategically important for urban authorities and their stakeholders, private sector, other sorts of public bodies, because of the way that it's intertwined with so many dimensions of urban life. Next slide, please. And what I think is happening, and Lauren talked a little bit about this, is the sort of ever more complex feedback loops. So we know that urbanization contributes significantly to planetary carbon emissions, which stimulates this debate about urban mitigation and carbon reduction. We know that more extreme weather is pushing for urban adaptation, for the protection of critical infrastructure. But I think there's a third feedback loop, which is what I'm particularly interested in here, which is about how do you maintain a safe operating space and develop the capacity to live with climate weather turbulence whilst minimizing the disruption to urban life. And I think this concept of urban weather modulation, which is a little bit clunky, is a way of trying to think about what do we do? How do we maintain urban economies, the infrastructure flows and everyday life in a period of weather-related turbulence? Next slide, please. And I think there's two strategies that are developing, not in any sort of necessarily systematic and particularly well thought through way, but I think it's possible to identify a bricolage of emerging responses about how to deal with an uncertain atmosphere. One of them is about recreating optimum weather inside through controlled environments, which I'll talk about first. And the second is actually about how you might be able to modulate the outside atmosphere to maintain livable spaces. So I'll start, next slide please, I'll just start with thinking through urban controlled environments. So we're all very familiar with air conditioning, which has a long history, but I think the argument here is that there's the emergence of new types of urban controlled environments, and they're emerging for particular reasons. It's no longer just about comfort, it's about they're strategically important for the maintenance of human and also, as we'll see, non-human life. And I think this captured quite nicely in these two quotes, where the modern city and urban landscape develops more and more into an operational unit of the sprawling triad of space station, greenhouse and human island. And also captured by Murphy in his very nice book about controlled environments. The greenhouse went from being a system of small scale control to a form of ark where nature could be maintained in the wider world. And I think the argument here is that controlled environments, the ability to volumetrically enclose an environment and to artificially create a particular atmospheric microclimate is of strategic importance. Next slide, please. And it's strategically important because this is about the sort of rescaling of the sort of interior ecologies of cabins and capsules and cars to a much larger scale. And it does that through technologically mediated processed atmospheres that are increasingly focused on the specific needs, not just of humans, but particular sorts of plant, animals, and food production. And these sort of environments are combining multiple forms of knowledge and expertise from architecture, building engineering, control systems, botany, zoology, to develop sort of premium customized environments that are able to secure life from a threatening outside. Next slide, please. And what's really interesting about this sort of the history of these systems, which I'm not going to go into in particular detail, but the critical role of military space technologies in developing systems that allowed humans to survive in really hostile environments of deep sea, the Arctic, Antarctic, and outer space have been really critical in developing these technologies, these that have become urban technologies. And this history is really quite important in understanding the ways that these are configured as forms of safety and resilience. Next slide, please. And you find examples of these sorts of highly engineered interiors at scale in all sorts of unusual contexts. Highly engineered interiors are used for enabling outdoor leisure activities that would normally be done outdoor can be done inside in a sort of artificially recreated nature. So there's a paper myself and John Rutherford did on these sorts of leisure environments. There's part of Manchester where you can go skiing, skydiving and ice climbing in different interiorized environments. A sort of a form of sort of synthetic natures they're not solely used for leisure and recreation spaces. There's sort of the claim that environments that incorporate nature and trees can be highly productive and highly creative. There's some of the claims around the Amazon biomes in Seattle. And there's sort of multifunctional consumption spaces like the Shan Chatir in Astana, the proposal for the Dubai Mall of the World, or the Sony Center in Berlin. There's a particularly interesting one just outside Berlin, Tropical Islands, a surreal experience of artificial sun, sea and sand all under one roof for those who cannot afford long-haul flights. So these sorts of environments are becoming more common, more frequent, particularly about their claim that they can provide 365 days a year stabilized environments that recreate aspects of an environment from another climate. Next slide, please. But it's not just for human use. There's been a rapid extension of the use of volumetric controlled environments for other sorts of threatened ecologies that are starting to emerge in urban areas, often built over existing zoos, botanical gardens, that claim that they are becoming really quite important in protecting and securing the reproduction of threatened ecologies that in nature whose future existence is under threat. Next slide, please. And I just want to say a little bit about one or two of those examples. Kew Gardens in London, known since 1917 as the botanical metropolis of the world, has some very famous exhibition greenhouses. Yet less well known is a private greenhouse that's constructed out of public view, a tropical nursery that recreates 21 different climate zones. And the ability to do this requires highly sophisticated forms of environmental control that cover humidity, temperature, watering. They even try and recreate wind for certain plants that need wind to grow more strongly. And this is controlled through unending amounts of variables. So the manual for this system is about 250 pages. It has a secure energy, self-contained energy system if it goes off grid. They treat their own water and store water in case there's a drought. It's a highly secure form of controlled environment. And its rationale is to support species that no longer exist in the wild. It's like a form of precision conservation. And it sort of starts to blur, as you'll see, the boundary between in situ, that's plants that occur out in nature, and ex situ, when for some of these plants, they only exist in these sorts of specialist greenhouses. Next slide, please. And this is a sort of form of strategic urban conservation without natural climate. They create a sort of form of artificial nature that doesn't really exist anywhere else. And without these sorts of climate control capacities, we would no longer have the ability to successfully hold and develop these collections. And they claim that some of the plants here are very rare or no longer exist in the wild. They now only exist in a climate-controlled facility to the west of London. Next slide, please. Another example from the Paris Zoo, which has a quite amazing volumetric recreation of parts of the Madagascan rainforest. And this is part of a shift that's underway in zoos to no longer just try to have individual animals, but to try to create a total ecosystem. Nature staged with the utmost precision, a city for animals. And these are highly automated and digitized and controlled environments. They use automation, electronic monitoring, cutting edge technologies to constantly work to keep animals in their comfort zones, despite the unpredictable winters and record-breaking heat waves. So these have to deal with extreme heat and cold. And again, this is part of the argument for the creation of these forms of controlled environment, is because, not just for climate change, but other social and economic and political reasons, these species are at risk in the wild, which is reshaping this notion of what we think about as in situ and ex situ, the urban and nature. Next slide, please. Why does this matter? Well, the capacity to create controlled environments and these forms of microclimates is reshaping the way in which conservationists now think about the interrelationship between in situ, in the wild, and ex situ, which means out of nature, in a controlled facility. They're now talking about the notion of thinking about threatened species of plants and animals under one plan. And the distinction between ex situ and in situ started to break down completely. And for many really seriously threatened species, the populations that are contained within these sorts of controlled environments are now counted and managed as part of the whole population, with sort of quite complex movements between urban areas and other sorts of environments, some of them outside the natural range of these animals. So something's happening here about how we think about the climate control capacity and the urban. Next slide, please. And it's not just plants and animals for conservation purposes that this is happening for. Also, the rapid expansion of controlled environment agriculture in the urban domain. This is about the recreation of optimal growing facilities for food production in urban areas. The most important innovation is not LED light emitting diodes, which have been very important for enabling enclosed spaces to use artificial lighting to control optimal food production. It is climate. 365 days a year, optimal growth conditions, regardless of the location and exterior climate conditions, can be produced. So you have to imagine in these sorts of facilities, every element of the sort of microclimate and atmosphere is artificially managed and mediated to speed up or slow down the production of plants in responsible to demand. And taking a climate recipe from one part of the world and reproducing it artificially in another is one of the coolest things ever. This was a quote from Grove Computer at Green Tech 2019. So the urbanization of these systems enables the urban domain to recreate optimal growing conditions for many different types of soft plants that are particularly tailored, which would never exist in any other context, often taking advantage of cheap energy at night to grow plants during the night, normal nights, but of course, using LED lighting, they can grow them at any time. Next slide, please. So what's happening here is the way in which these sort of controlled ecologies are really quite important in these strategies of rethinking not only conservation, but also food production that create a more secure apparatus for the reproduction of non-human life. And it's almost as though this is a sort of form of climate control as a form of sort of vital system of security, the ability to maintain, manage, recreate, optimize microclimatic conditions is becoming strategically important. Yet it obviously has new risks. It's high cost. There's issues about the population size, genetic variability, limited adaptation, and also the security of these places as well is really significantly important because of the risk of destroying an entire population. So I think when we think about climate enclosure and these sorts of controlled environments, we need to think about them in terms of how they relate to other spaces. So spaces of sort of nature conservation outside of the urban domain, food production outside of the urban domain, and the way in which these are becoming hybridized in really quite complicated and complex ways, where we're seeing rural food production being urbanized, conservation activity in the urban these urban centres that have these highly technical and costly capacities to maintain nature are reshaping the relationship between the sort of periphery and the sort of urban cores. Next slide, please. Now, the other strategy, so we talked a lot about controlled environments. So the sort of interiorization and the creation of volumetric enclosure to deal with a hostile atmosphere. There's another set of responses that are emerging, which is about, can we modulate the atmosphere itself to ensure that it's optimized to maintain a safe operating space for human life and for plants and animals? And I think increasingly you can argue there's attempts to intervene to reshape the use of outdoor space. Like, when can you go outdoors? When is it safe to go outdoors? Which types of humans are vulnerable to, say, for example, heat extremes and should stay indoors and shelter, where healthy humans can go outdoors, or attempts to thermally regulate the temperatures of outdoor space. So the argument here is that we can't just focus on interiorization as a response to a hostile outdoor environment. There's actually a set of interventions that are trying to modify and regulate the use of outdoor environments and outdoor space. Next slide, please. And key to this, if we just use the example of heat, a sort of a bricolage of sort of practices, technologies and techniques drawn from a whole wide range of disciplines, even including, we found examples of companies who specialized in conditioning indoor spaces and using some of their techniques and technologies to condition and air condition outdoor spaces. These are sort of trying to modify the use and qualities of the outdoor milieu, the sort of space between the upper atmosphere and terrestrial life, a sort of that boundary of atmospheric domain, through cooling, through using wind, through vegetation, through technologies as well as passive and design measures to try to modulate temperatures. Next slide, please. And there's a set of, as much as the interiorization of controlled environments relies on new technologies, there's been a shift underway in the monitoring and measurement of the outdoor atmosphere. And I think you could call this almost the urbanization of weather forecasting. It's the development of specialist platforms, weather monitoring, sensing and forecasting systems. They're often called nowcasting, that can produce very short term but very fine grained for a very small part of the urban area. And these are seen as being really quite important for how we manage atmospheric extremes and weather-related extremes of too much heat, too much rain, too much humidity. The ability to understand what conditions are creates the possibility that they can be managed. So there's a whole set of smart weather apps, domestic weather stations, Aerator, Extrema, that use crowdsourcing, that give you very precise information about the temperatures in a particular local area. The World Meteorological Organization has set up a series of integrated service platforms that try to sort of think about disaster reduction risk strategies for utilizing weather knowledge and expertise, and intelligent weather dashboard products and services customized to particular sectors. And these are all about trying to render different aspects of the atmosphere knowable and actionable. Next slide, please. And it puts a sort of premium on the left-hand side of this table, the potential to have very short-term forecasts of atmospheric conditions enables users, public organizations, logistics companies, local authorities to be able to try to manage turbulence in real time. because of the ability of this sort of smart weather movement to try to create these much more accurate short-term and much more lower, smaller scale forecasts. Next slide, please. To the extent that I think there's a sort of emerging sort of sector of almost sort of atmospheric smart management, and where this is a US company, Tomorrow.io, better operational decision making with weather intelligence. Welcome to the all-in-one weather dashboard. And the claim is that organizations can be prepared for extreme weather events by better understanding how they, for example, change the distribution routes, how they avoid certain sorts of areas, how they might temporarily suspend a service in some areas, or even preemptively go in advance, try to improve drainage and check that drainage ditches are cleared in particular sorts of areas. These are being incorporated into these sort of new technologies and products, not just for inside environments, but also for outside environments. Next slide, please. And there's a set of technologies that are being developed for humans, for districts, around how do we cool outside spaces if we know that outside spaces are going to be uncomfortable. So there's a number of examples here. There's many products now, personal cooling suits, initially developed by the military, with a lot of interest by security forces and military about how do they keep their military forces operational during heat waves, turned into sort of domestic products now that you can buy cooling systems. On the left-hand side, there's outdoor Habitat, a Singapore company, does outdoor air conditioning. That images of Dubai with misting fans. The movement of air and the use of misting can be very effective for getting cooling. Outdoor cooling at the World Cup. And the other example is of indoor air conditioning units being used outdoors. So there's a huge amount of effort being made to modify the outdoor environment, often transmuting and utilizing technologies that we've used indoors, outdoors. So alongside the development of better knowledge of the atmosphere, there's attempts to constitute ways of intervening. Next slide, please. And this is just an example from a US company showing the range, not a particularly urban slide, but what's really interesting about these cooling systems is that they're not just for humans. They're also being used by farmers. So the productivity of dairy cattle drops enormously once temperature exceeds certain limits. And they're using these cooling techniques, not just using them in restaurants, high density urban areas for humans. They're being used to cool down farm animals to maintain levels of dairy production. They're being used for mosquito control, odor control, greenhouse humidification. So there's a whole sector being developed around customizing and modulating the sort of atmospheric milieu in order to maintain safety, security, comfort, and productivity. Next slide, please. Really, and the examples I've given have been drawn from lots of different contexts, many of which you can also find in the Australian context. But China's very, very interesting. Its utilization of atmospheric technologies for a whole range of purposes, sometimes controlling heat, dust, the disinfection. There's a very sophisticated and large-scale weather modification capacity was used during every day in an everyday sense to deal with weather extremes, but particularly became visible during the Beijing Olympics. And the utilization of outdoor cooling systems, in the case of the one on the right, as an explicit attempt to compete with an indoor shopping complex that can keep customers cool. This is Tianzifan in Shanghai, and they discovered that customers wouldn't come to this area lanes because it was too hot in the summer, and so they installed an outdoor misting system. I mean, the point I think here is it's not just happening in China; it's happening in a whole set of multiple contexts. There's an attempt to try to claim that we can modify and fix the atmosphere at an urban scale. Next slide, please. And it's changing the way in which architects think about buildings. So we've generally thought about the indoors and outdoors as being really relatively simply understood. But what's happening now is with this sort of blurring of sort of the creation of even more specialist indoor conditions and the modulation of the outside, it's coming together in the ways in which some architects and engineers are trying to think of a new language to describe what they've called here interior hybrid zones, a semi-conditioned space, an exterior hybrid zone, which is climate protected but doesn't necessarily have technologies of intervention. I think there's something happening here about a way in which, how do we understand, I mean, the basic simple understanding of inside or outside is being disrupted by these sorts of shifts and the emergence of these capacities and techniques. Next slide, please. There's also lots of really interesting examples. It's sometimes called meteorological architecture of the design of outdoor spaces incorporating forms of heat management, cooling, sometimes actually heating. And I've not talked particularly much about the outdoor heating sector, but very significant with the use of underground pipe networks to maintain urban life, airports, key areas and zones under conditions of cold and snow and ice. Next slide, please. So this was something I came across in on a website. It was about around the world. It was cities that had perfect weather. Here's the ideal route for an around the world trip in perfect weather conditions between 21 and 24 degrees centigrade. And it turned out that the travel industry do a listing of the number of pleasant days. And I began to wonder, what would this listing look like in 10 years' time? So this was a listing, and this is a listing of sort of cities, but actually doesn't take into account what's happening in terms of attempts to constitute and manage comfortable and pleasant days, and crucially, which parts of cities, urban areas, become subject to these sorts of systems and technologies. And but I think this sort of helps us understand how there's attempts to constitute notions of perfect weather going on in a whole series of different domains of human and non-human life to produce new notions of perfect, productive, safe, secure weather. Next slide, please. So why does this matter? And so just as a way of trying to draw this together, I think the argument here is if we start to think about atmospheric futures, we need to think about the way in which the inside and outside are being relationally reconfigured and technicized, digitized, monitored, and attempts are being made to try to manipulate and manage atmospheres, in some cases using what's called sort of precision systems, where they're optimized around particular plants, animals, or levels of growth. In others, it's about trying to maintain a safe operating space for humans. And this is not about the elimination of sort of extreme weather or weather turbulence. It's not really about mitigation. This is about the modulation of the dynamics of atmospheric turbulence to develop new ways of living with climate crisis. That's what I think this is about. And the urban context becomes subject to new, some of them are passive and nature-based, but many of them are actively technological modes of management, misting, cooling, smart weather, new multiple control systems, where new capacities can be introduced, this notion of 365-day precision weather, perfect weather, secure and safe environments, and the relationship between the city and planetary change, the claim is at least it can be modulated in some way. But of course, this sort of, it introduces its own uncertainties, risks, but it also, an uneven work of technically mediated microclimates, some of them indoors and some of them outdoors, over existing territorial and atmospheric milieu. And I think the claim here is that somehow it's possible to sort of atmospherically disconnect from the uncertain meteorological commons. And what we might be looking at here is a way in which volumetric atmospheric disconnection, which actually to some extent has other hidden histories associated with it, may become a sort of normalized practice for urban futures. And on that point, I'll end. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Simon. I'm sure there's a big round of applause through all of our precariously connected interior spaces here. There's so much to think about and unpack there, isn't there? I mean, just all of the, you know, from the kind of stuff happening around us by companies and others doing things through to kind of what does it mean in our own lives and how we're imbricated in doing it. And I must admit, there has been some air conditioning going on in this particular space today, this afternoon as well. So if you want to pop your, I can't see you, but I think my internet's playing up. So if your camera is on, that's great. I'd like to ask everybody online to start thinking about some questions and comments. And you can either raise your hand using the raise function or pop your camera on if you'd like to speak. And of course, you're also very welcome to just pop a comment or question in the chat as well, and I can read it out. But to just get us going, Simon, I'm really, really interested in the kind of, I guess, temporal horizon that some of the people you spoke to seem to imagine. So I'm talking here about some of these very techno-mediated futures, in particular looking at those ones, I was thinking around the conservation ones, which are very future oriented in that they're about the perpetuation of species. You know, they're quite futuristic in the way they're doing things, but at the same time in investing so much in such kind of a rigid control model, they, to my kind of slightly more disaster-esque kind of way of thinking, also seem to be somewhat in denial of the future. Can you tell us a bit more about what some of the people you interviewed, particularly around Kew Gardens and the conservation field, what sort of, how they imagine the future? What's their sort of justification for this approach?
Professionally, they're really uncomfortable with this one planet approach. When we in the interviews, they put a lot of emphasis on their work that they do in situ, the work they do in Madagascar, parts of Africa, or wherever. That's really what people, I think, professionally are driven by. But then there's a sort of I think there's two things that certainly happen. Is that there's a recognition that the in situ is also heavily managed and technicized now. So increasingly, techniques that have been used in ex situ environments are used in situ environments. So there's a sort of there's a blurring that's taking place in terms of the techniques and the technologies that, you know, nature doesn't really exist any longer. It's a nature that's been reshaped by human agency, and I think so. But there's still a way in which in situ conservation is the pinnacle and the peak for what people would like to be happening. So the second dimension is that they recognise that ex situ populations are actually really important. So there's a discomfort at relying on ex situ populations, but a recognition that there's been quite a few instances where those ex situ populations have been really significantly important for reintroductions, for trying to get better genetic diversity. So they've had a really critical role. And I think, and then actually there's a third dimension, which is these sorts of the genetic role of the ex situ in the controlled environments is also about the potential for repopulating new ecologies that may well be suitable because of climate change for plants or animal resources that couldn't find a safe home elsewhere. So I think it's that blurring of the boundary that's taking place. But actually, I don't think professionally people feel really comfortable about it. And I recognise the risks and vulnerabilities associated with it.
Yeah. It's interesting that the point about genetics that you're bringing up there. So, you know, genetics has always been a bit of a contentious topic in the conservation world, but, you know, very much now there's this sort of more functional view of turning to try to preserve the genetic diversity of a population versus preserving, for example, number of individuals. And then that gets me thinking about epigenetics and the sort of increasing realization that our genetics don't just sit in some kind of tightly sealed envelope inside us somewhere, but are in fact much more interactive with our environments than perhaps we had considered. Is genetics something that's coming up? I mean, thinking across to maybe now your agricultural examples, genetics is huge. I know that one of the other tactics they're using in the dairy farming industry, which I could bang on about for a long time, is breeding heat-resistant cows. But how's genetics playing out in these initiatives that are trying to, what did you call it, about the create premium environments when you've already got a kind of move towards premium genetics?
Yeah, I mean, that issue about how I hadn't understood they were trying to identify heat resistant cows, but there's a lot of work on trying to identify how much heat different types of humans can bear. Actually, it's not just it's quite fascinating that there's an attempt to understand the implications of high heat for children, the elderly, people with different types of diseases to try it. And that's being linked to some of this sort of smart tech stuff as well. There's a sort of sense in which, you know, which humans will be safe to go outdoors in different types of heat extreme. And it's interesting to know that's happening with productive animals as well, actually. Slightly disturbing, but of course it's totally in some senses makes a lot of sense. I think what's happening with the sort of controlled environment agriculture is that I don't know the extent to which genetics plays a role in this, but the companies themselves are trying to copyright particular sorts of climate recipes to try to so as they optimize production. Well, the challenge is to not just optimize production, but it's to try to ensure that production matches demand. And as demand for food products varies during the week, during the year, there's an attempt to try to slow and speed the production of greens, of strawberries, to sort of better match that demand. I think there's ways in which there's attempts to sort of copyright that and make that for a form of intellectual property. And it's the way that I think climate control becomes intertwined with other sorts of IP, financial and intellectual resources that's really quite intriguing about this. And possibly there's a genetic dimension of this, which is not something that I've explored, but I'm sure one would find.
Yeah, well, I mean, the links between precision conservation, as you said, and then you think about precision medicine. I mean, are we all going to be offered our kind of personalised optimum climate recipe down the track? I'll leave you to ponder that. Marco, would you like to ask a question? Marco, just speak up if you message. Oh, Marco can't.
I can. I can
Okay.
now. Sorry. Okay, all good. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Lauren. Hi, Simon. Yeah, a really fascinating talk. I mean, just such a wide range of different instances of, and I particularly really enjoyed this kind of, new vocabulary, new grammars for describing what is actually quite a dystopian, unequal, and potentially unsafe future for many people as we effectively make the concept of the outdoors extinct. And I just kind of wonder, though, when you say, why does this matter? I mean, for me, it matters a lot from a historical perspective. And I was increasingly thinking about, the historical links that exist between what you were talking about. So take, for example, atmospheric modulation. Of course, there's miasma. There's, in some ways, heat has become, our current equivalent of miasma. And the way in which urban decision makers are trying to modulate the atmosphere is very similar to what they were trying to do in 17th century Paris, albeit for completely different reasons. And the other is the sort of the encapsulation of the urban environment. Reminded me a lot of Joseph Paxton, who of course is a sort of great greenhouse designer come architect of Crystal Palace, the world's first modern building, and then of course the designer of the world's first public park. So there's kind of very strong, interesting kind of historical links, I think, with what you're saying. And I got the feeling that you were actually claiming all of this is kind of really new and dystopian, but actually it's deeply historically situated within modernism and the Enlightenment.
Yeah. I cut out a whole load of. You're quite right. I mean, the Crystal Palace and Joseph Paxton. There was an explicit sort of link made with the polluting air of London, and it was a really interesting debate. I spent some time in the V&A looking at the sort of Crystal Palace archive. And there was an absolutely fascinating debate about what to do with Crystal Palace. And there was a proposal that they should actually break up Crystal Palace and construct parts of it over new working class housing to protect the working class from the sort of air pollution of London. It was really, really interesting. And there was all sorts of proposals about using glass arcades and linking them with railway lines. I'd say there's a whole history about that. I mean, even the sort of ideas about dome over Manhattan, Buckminster Fuller. There's a whole series of sort of attempts to constitute a sort of inside protection from the outside. And I haven't talked particularly. I alluded a little bit to the space connection, which is another really powerful connection as well. And I agree with you that we need to that history is important. This isn't all totally new. I think what is new about this, though, is that the importance of those sort of problematic. There was a brilliant book, if any of you have, on air pollution by Mark Whitehead, and I was really struck reading Mark Whitehead's book when he talks about the bricolage of efforts to control air pollution right back from the medieval period, and the multiple forms of experimentation that took place was really resonant of what's happening around heat now. This bricolage of lots of different techniques, technologies and practices and possibilities, and the problematization of heat. reminded me of that sort of his sort of fantastic analysis. But I think the scale of the problem, the percentage of the urban population who would be affected by longer duration, more frequent, more extreme heat events. This is really sort of a sort of incredibly significant scale of problematic, and its implications for food production and nature more widely.
Yeah, I think it might be that scalar issue. So if miasmas were around particular areas, we're talking around about something where there is no rural ideal that we can escape to here in terms of that. But yeah, great point. And it is deeply modernist. I mean, you look at it, it's kind of almost amusingly modernist. And I should point everyone to Marco's recent book that looks at things of this nature. Thank you, Marco. We also have a question from Jiru, and Jiru, if I've mispronounced that, apologies. It's about this really important question of prediction, which is particularly apparent in what you're talking about with weather forecasting, Simon, and just about the difficulties of being able to predict these things. And under climate change, weather forecasting and climate projections are becoming more difficult, which is kind of an interesting epistemological challenge when you've discovered something that's also trying to blind you. But what you're talking about, Simon, was a kind of reinforcement of that earlier tendency towards accuracy and precision in forecasting and prediction, you know, at finer and finer scales, being able to tie production and processes closer and closer to get that optimum. So there's a real tension between different logics, but could you just talk a little bit about that issue of uncertainty, but also the turn to prediction at the same time?
Yeah, so I've been reading a bit about the history of meteorology and the urban in the meteorological, and which I know you've written about, Laura, and quite a few other people have. And the sort of urban area was a real problem for meteorologists because they weren't able to make forecasts for urban areas because of the complexity of the urban domain. So they were just sort of incorporated into, I think, what they called regional scale forecasts. And I think what's been happening is attempts to understand urban weather. So I think there's been a lot of work done in meteorology that's really tried to understand the sort of interconnections between the urban layer and the various atmospheric layers. And alongside the sort of, it really amazes me, the debates about the smart city have been really disconnected from this sort of emergence of a debate about smart weather. And the smart weather as a sector has grown significantly in scale, and the involvement of research institutes and private companies to try to constitute an understanding of the urban domain in a way that wasn't possible 20 or 30 years ago. Now, what's really interesting about it is the case we looked at the most was Rio de Janeiro, and the control room at Rio, something that wasn't really talked about, the IBM control. It wasn't really IBM, it was a Brazilian control room. But the fundamental underlying motivation for developing the control room in Rio was the modulation and management of weather. And as well as a huge investment in sort of technologies of radar, lightning measurement, software, this sort of micro level, short-term, very spatially specific weather forecasting requires a large amount of interpretation by humans. So there's a sort of paradox in this, that actually this is not okay. It's highly highly reliant on sort of monitoring, sensing and technological system, but it requires a high degree of human intervention in the process to understand contextually what the issues are. And it's almost done in real, it's almost real time. So the Rio control room would be reporting on the weather literally as and providing advice in these very, very short-term increments. And often it wouldn't be a problem. It might not turn out to be a problem. But what they were interested in, so it's sort of, you almost have to have like, it's almost like a logistical rationality that you're attempting to manage the urban domain almost 15, 30, 2 hours ahead. If you do really think you're going to have, in the context of Rio, a major storm over a particular area of town, the city, they claimed they would mobilize emergency workers, safe havens, they would actually do prior work. I think it's the way in which this sort of, so I don't want to overstate these sorts of capacities of these systems. They are in the sort of risk management framework, but a very short-term logistical risk management framework. But I think increasingly significant the way that these sorts of products are now being offered to commercial entities, municipalities, and local authorities. It's a sort of how to manage ecology in almost real time.
Absolutely. And just thinking of real time, just to finish off here, I know we're starting to get towards bedtime here in Australia, and you probably need to get up with your day. But I did want to just end by just asking about some of these feedbacks that you relied on. And I guess, I come to this as someone who looks at critical infrastructure kind of collapses and resilience questions. I mean, are we... So we've got, this proliferation of interiorized spaces that are both for sort of optimum production, but also increasingly securing survival in various ways. Really investing in a reliance on being able to shut out that external threatening environment. But of course, the equipment that we rely on to create that interior safe space is situated outside. Are we going to see a kind of onion-like effect where all the air conditioners, you get those shots, we're all familiar with those shots of the air conditioners that just kind of layer on like sort of scaly skin on a high-rise building? Are we going to get those enveloped in some kind of cooling system? And then that cooling system has to get enveloped in something, and then you never escape. Sorry, it's a bit of a...
Yes.
But this onion-like effect, like how do you escape something being outside when the outside is threatening?
Yeah. The air conditioning example is absolutely fascinating. So air conditioning units don't work effectively at really high temperatures and high humidity. So there's a new product. There's a new product that's been developed by the outdoor cooling sector that cools the air before it goes into the air conditioning unit, and it dramatically increases the efficiency and lowers the energy consumption of the air conditioning unit. So we have this paradoxical situation already where the air conditioning unit designed to maintain a safe indoor temperature now needs the air going into it to be pre-cooled. And if you search this is it's quite a big sector now. So we're getting those sorts of paradoxes. There's products now to cool down the petrol pump payment system computers because they won't work effectively in high temperatures. There's air conditioning units, portable air conditioning units you can now buy to go camping in the summer in the US. I mean, this sort of like the paradox of these systems is quite phenomenal. And I think this is why I think we need to think about the inside and outside together, because even protection inside requires interventions in the outside atmospheric environment to reliably maintain an efficient and effective interior space. And that's the sort of world it looks like we're going to be living in, with those sorts of inversions. It's like an inversion of an inversion. Air conditioning was meant to help us. It was developed for very particular reasons, but part of what it's used for now is to make indoor space comfortable. But we now have to modulate the outdoor air that goes into air conditioning to make it work. They're the inversions that I think we're starting to see. We'll see more of.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have this, like, if you squeezing one more question from Zoe here, just following on from this about these flow-on effects, and we won't even go into the heat sensitivity of electricity equipment because it's nightmarish stuff. The flow-on effects here of technological modulation, and have they really started to examine this? For example, whether misting systems increase particulate matter due to evaporation and residual matter from the water used, so, which is, we know water quality is an issue under climate change. Are people starting to actually think systemically about this stuff?
Slowly they are doing. I mean, there's the sort of the sector of outdoor, so the interior climate control sector is quite well understood and organized as a sector, but the outside cooling and heating sector is really a bricolage. There's no standards. The sort of cooling of the outside doesn't really it falls between lots of disciplines, and lots of disciplines and professions have taken an interest in it, from landscape, nature-based solutions, engineering, and to be honest, it's a little bit of a free-for-all, really, in the claim there's very little independent verification of the effectiveness of the systems. Yeah, you can spread Legionella through these systems unless you treat the water that's going into it effectively. There's very little monitoring of their effectiveness, but they're very popular, and there is some systemic reviews that shows the evidence for how well and quite well they can reduce air temperatures quite significantly. But actually, the issue is there's lots of things you probably would do with passive and green measures before you'd use these highly technical, energy-intensive methods, and there's not really a framework for thinking about that either. Yeah, I think lots of issues for researchers.
Well, we also, we just have to think elementally about this too, don't we? I mean, we haven't really talked about water, but it's clearly, being harnessed here as a tool to kind of help out the atmosphere. But, let's not pretend, that it's not part of climatic effects as well. So, yeah, lots and lots of things to think about. So thank you, everybody, for persevering, both to get here and then through the hour and a half on an evening. And thank you particularly to Simon for beaming in from Beatrix Potter's cottage in the Lake District to tell us about these futuristic things that are emerging in our midst. I think we're going to think about our own atmospheres quite the same now. So thank you very much. And really appreciate it. And thank you to Ralph for helping organise the Urban Futures Symposium that this is part of. And congratulations to any PhD students on the line who are doing their milestones this week. So thanks, everybody. We'll leave it there. And look forward to engaging with you in the future. So thank you.